Hi, thank you for joining us on one of the most comprehensive podcasts devoted exclusively to family offices, Family Office World. I'm your host, Ron Diamond, Chairman and CEO of Diamond Wealth. Stay tuned for today's episode. Well, I'm thrilled to have Randy Quarles as our guest today. Randy took office as a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in October 2017, filling an unexpired term that ended in January 2018. He was reappointed to the board in July 2018 for a term ending January 31st, 2032. He was also sworn in as vice chair for supervision in October 2017, and his term for that position ended in October 2021. Randy graduated summa cum laude from Columbia University in 1981 with a degree in philosophy and economics, and earned a law degree from Yale Law School in 1984. Prior to his appointment to the board, Randy was founder and managing director of the Cynosure Group, a Utah-based investment firm. Before founding the firm, he was a partner at the Carlyle Group. Randy served as Undersecretary for Domestic Finance at the Department of Treasury from September 2005 to November 2006, and Assistant Secretary for International Affairs from April 2002 to August 2005. During this tenure, Randy served as public chair of the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. Prior to joining the Department of the Treasury, he was the U.S. Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund from August 2001 to April 2002. From January 1991 to January 1993, Randy served as Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Treasury for Banking, Legislation, and was Deputy Assistant to the Secretary of Treasury for Financial Institutions. Prior to and in between his service as Department of the Treasury, he was a partner at Davis, Polk, and Wardell, serving in New York and London offices. I guess my first question, Randy, how many hours of sleep do you get?
Well, that was that was a pretty fulsome introduction. So thank you for that. I'll make sure to remind my wife of it when she lets me know that I've once again forgotten that they come to pick up the garbage on Thursday mornings instead of Friday mornings. But
Right. So you have the Eccles Family Office. It's really fascinating because out where you are in Salt Lake City and in the Northwest, you're very similar to like what the Pritzkers are in Chicago. You've done a ton philanthropically. You've done a lot with sports teams and just a whole. Can you take a minute and I guess I'd like to get started. Talk about the origins of the Eccles family. Like, how did they initially make their money? When did that happen? How did that happen? And then I've got several more questions. But it's a fascinating story, and you guys have really, you're really almost the gold standard in what to do for family offices. But I'd love to hear a little bit of the background.
sure. Well, the story of the family in the United States, it really begins in the middle of the 19th century. The Eccles were impoverished Scots living in the slums of Glasgow, and were converted to the Mormon Church. And one of the programs of the church in those days, in the middle of the 19th century, was to lend people money so that they could come to Utah. So it was about 1860, 69, I think, that the family emigrated from Scotland to Utah, arrived here. The patriarch of the family was a blind wood carver. The family survived. He made household utensils on a lathe, not being able to see. And the children, particularly the most industrious of them, a young boy named David Eccles, would then go out and sell them in the area around Glasgow in Scotland, and then would sell them when they arrived here in Utah. So they arrived with nothing, were assigned to a little mountain town up outside of Ogden, Utah, where the first few years were just filled with privations. But very gradually, particularly due to the enterprise of young David, he began to collect capital from hiring out his labor, and then he bought a wood mill, and that turned into a lumber operation, kind of bringing lumber down from Oregon into Utah, which was the area of the West that was growing most rapidly in the 1860s, really, before it was overtaken by California and other places. But kind of the building out of the Intermountain West, particularly Utah, taking the lumber from the Northwest and bringing it down into the Intermountain West, was the core of the family's business. And then that expanded to construction and railroads and hotels and sugar beets and banking and then eventually, when David Eccles died in 1912, running for a train, at his funeral, all traffic in 5 states stopped. All work stopped for 5 minutes at the time that his funeral was set to begin, to sort of reflect the role that he had come to play in the Intermountain West. And then in the 20th century, his children carried that forward in both industry and philanthropy. Some of the Eccles enterprises, the Utah Construction became the largest mining and construction company in the world. First Security Bank was the largest bank between Denver and San Francisco. The family were large shareholders in Union Pacific, and then all of those companies were eventually sold to much larger private companies at the end of the 20th century.
So it's a fascinating story. It's like the classic American success story. You know, even in the beginning, philanthropy seemed to be very important to, the founders, and it's certainly carried to your generation now. Why is philanthropy so important to your family?
Well, I think it really all comes down to that first loan that allowed the Eccles to leave the slums of Scotland and come to America, and sort of the sense that everything has flown from that, and the family's philanthropic efforts are concentrated generally in the Intermountain West. There are some things that are done sort of in California and also back east, but for the most part, concentrated in the Intermountain West, in that this was to pay back the results of that original loan.
Well, you guys have, certainly in your area, you're one of the most philanthropic families. So I think it's terrific what you guys have done. Can you talk for a minute? You've got a family office. I want to talk about the origins of the family office, why you created it, but you've really got a unique model with Sinosure. So can you kind of take a minute and talk about kind of what you do? Because it is a family office, but it's more than just a family office.
Yeah. So, we can start with the name Sinosure, which was while it's Greek for the North Star and means an object of admiration, it's also the name of the boat that the family came to America on. So it's a reflection of it's a reflection again of the origin story. But as I mentioned, the family's sort of private assets had all been sold to large public companies. And so the family at the end of the 20th century, so at the beginning of the 21st century, the task, if you will, was, so what to do with these very concentrated positions in a handful of large public companies. At the beginning of the 21st century, the family were the largest shareholders in General Electric, for example. And the story of General Electric over the last 25 years would suggest that's a position that was good to diversify, as opposed to have that concentrated position. And in the early 2000s, we began to to make significant commitments to private equity. And at the same time, I became, as you noted, a partner at the Carlyle Group. So I was both on the producing side and the consumer side of private equity. Um, and it seemed to me that there were a variety of ways in which the private equity industry had evolved that were not really congenial for a family office. Um, uh, in many ways, what the private equity industry did was what the Eccles family had done for 150 years. There was no Eccles that invented a new way of making steel or any patent medicine, or it was a matter of gathering partners to make investments in businesses that they intended to hold for a long period of time and to grow those and improve those businesses. And ultimately, the profit would come from those investments. But there were a number of differences from how that type of private company investing had evolved in the private equity industry. One, the family had held a lot of those investments for much longer than the typical private equity hold period. Two, the family was generally not intent. They invested in businesses that they thought would grow with the team that was there, as opposed to there was very little leverage because the family in the very early part of the 20th century, there'd been a big blow up in one branch of the family because of excessive leverage. And so there was very little leverage that was put on the investments. The growth was intended to come from the growth of the company. Not infrequently, the family and its partners would be minority investors behind a management that appeared to be working well with the company, and the family was willing to provide growth capital for a long period of time. And none of that really fit with the private equity model. Hold periods have become shorter and shorter. When I became a partner at Carlyle, the rule of thumb was 5 to 7 years, and 7 years wasn't going to be uncommon. By the time I left, it was 3 to 5 years. And really, at 3 years, you were seriously thinking about how to sell this company. And that's very disruptive to companies. As I sometimes like to say, that company that became the largest mining and construction company in the world, if David Eccles had sold it 3 years after he bought it, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. So so it seemed to me that there was an opportunity to create a company, an investing program that would take the best of what we've learned about private company investing in the 21st century through the private equity industry, but apply some of these principles that the Eccles family had learned over the course of a century and a half. And that would, and then as part of that, we thought if we could do that, then, and that solved a problem for us, it would solve a problem for others in the same way that, again, over the course of 150 years, it was generally not just Eccles capital that went into what were thought of as Eccles enterprises in this part of the world. It was partners that we'd invested in alongside of. And that creating a company, if you will, as opposed to just a family investment operation, would also create a currency, the equity value of that company, that would help us compensate and retain the very best investment professionals, that we could bring on people and say, not only will we compensate you appropriately and handsomely for successful investment returns, which you have to do to get the best investment advice, but you'll be building equity value in a company operation, although it will be its owned and controlled by the family, but you'll be building equity value as well, which is yet a further means of compensation. And that has proven to be an important part of how we've retained a top flight investment team.
It's interesting because I know you just brought on Bill Woodson, who's a good friend, and he's best in class, certainly in the family office space. Can you just touch a little bit on, because I see family offices, many of them, I look at family offices, many of them as very fragmented and very siloed and somewhat inefficient. And you guys have, for lack of a better term, have sort of institutionalized it, similar to what the Pritzkers have done and what the Crowns have done.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about how to compensation as far as how to attract the best talent, because you're not gonna, it's not a cost. Hiring somebody like Bill is not a cost. He's a potential huge profit center. So can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah. So we have, again, similar to what I told the story of the private equity side of the firm. The family had investment needs as well with the new position in the 21st century with all of those liquid assets of sort of the high net worth wealth advice. And there are 10 or 12 Eccles foundations that have been established over the generations that conduct most of the philanthropy in this part of the world. And we needed portfolio and endowment, portfolio management, foundation and endowment portfolio management for those foundations. And we did the same thing with each of those needs, if you will, which is if we can create a group that satisfies our need, that ought to be something that will satisfy the needs of others who don't want to go to the trouble and cost of creating a group of their own. And then commercializing that group, therefore, can again create equity, which we can use to add to the compensation of the folks that we recruit to run those functions. And that's a win-win for everyone. It is, I had seen at the time we put Cynosure together about a decade ago, across all of these different needs, private asset investment need, foundation and endowment, management need, high net worth advice need. I'd seen people either try to do it on the cheap or they didn't really, they knew what they wanted, but they hadn't run investment firms before. And there's just a lot of rakes that you can step on. And, I think that it's good for the system to evolve in a way that there are groups that say, look, our careers have allowed us to have this sort of expertise in order to create this, and it will be first and foremost created to solve our own needs. But if it can do that, it can solve the needs of others too, who just don't want to go through that pain of creating that operation. And so that's useful for them, that they don't have to go through the pain. It's useful for the investment professionals, that there's equity created in an actual business. It's useful for everyone in that the best investment professionals can be attracted to this sort of an operation. And so, with the team that came on with Bill Woodson for high net worth advice, a significant part of how they're compensated is through the equity growth in the value of this advisory firm, of which the family are the anchor clients.
You started, this is almost a 200-year-old family, since the beginning. Statistically, 25% of families make it to the second generation, and 10% make it to the third, and 5% to the fourth. So you've done exponentially better than that. Outside of compensation, what has been, because it's lasted so long, is there a secret sauce, or what has been the secret to maintaining this? Because there's a lot of really bright, well-intentioned family offices, but they just fizzle out. But yours didn't. So there has to be some reason for it.
Well, a lot of that has to do with the, I guess a word is socialization, possibly. A lot of it has to do with the attitude of the family. Everyone, in each generation is raised to understand, accept really isn't the right word, to embrace the fact that it's all being managed together. There's been relatively little fragmentation, with people saying, well, I want to do my thing and I want to go my way. People have, obviously all the opportunity to have input, but, from the time folks are quite young, it's, the family is a unit of one, and all of this will be maintained for everyone's benefit. And that's been the case through all of the generations. We've been fortunate in that way that there hasn't been a lot of fragmentation. A great desire on the part of the family to have it well managed, yes, but managed as one, and that's allowed it to keep together.
So you run, you're spearheading this. What's the biggest challenge? Because a lot of people, it's not just a corporation, right? You've got people, you've got family members. What's the biggest challenge for somebody like you to do this? Because you've done something right.
So far, we're very pleased with how this has evolved, with this concept has evolved. I do think that it's, it has turned out to be the right answer for the family for the 21st century. My brother-in-law and I, who sort of had the project here, we talk about we're planning for the next 100 years after the last 100 years, and so we're happy with how the first decade of the next 100 years has started out. Where the biggest challenge, I think, with our model is balancing then the needs of the family and family ownership, if you will, with the needs of a commercial operation, right? So I do think that it's been very useful for us to be able to compensate non-family investment professionals with equity in a growing investment operation, in a growing actual investment firm. How will we give them liquidity for that equity if it's always going to remain fundamentally a family company?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's, there are examples of how that has happened over generations. The Rothschilds, have, a significant operation with non-family investment professionals, the Davids with Lazards before it went public. But that is a big issue. How do you maintain the family character of the company? Well, nonetheless, it's a real company that has, if you're going to offer equity as a means of compensation, if that's not just profit sharing, if you will, and is going to be real equity. So how do you give people liquidity for that equity? And how do you balance the needs of all the various investment clients? That's not as hard because the family is really quite aligned with all the other clients. I think that's part of the advantage of our structure, which is, we're still about a quarter of everything that's invested everywhere around the firm. And so other people know that we care a lot about how the investments are made. But that's, that's a work in progress as to how we're going to balance those issues, particularly between the investment professionals and their making sure they have their fair share in what they are helping to build, the needs of a family company that's intended to remain such for 100 years.
Very similar to, I did a podcast with Tony Pritzker, and very similar thought process, very similar mindset, and very similar challenges. And I think both of you guys have figured out a way to, you haven't solved everything, but it's a very challenging thing to do. One of the things I like to ask is, because in family offices, most people don't fully understand like the world of family offices. We invest alongside about 100 of them, so I get it. How do you network with other family offices? And is that something you guys have done a great job at? Not so good? You plan to do better? How important is that?
I think we've done a fine job at it and plan to do more. I think that it's very useful. I think it's useful for the family office world generally to have an understanding of the world, of what options are out there. We learn things from talking to other folks who have similar challenges. I think they can learn things from talking to how we've addressed the same challenges. We've invested alongside the Pritzkers in a few investments, and we've learned from them as to how they've approached those investments, and that's been a very successful process. I think so there's a lot to be done there. There are family office gatherings that we do attend. Some of them we're hosting one in a month or so here in Utah, along with David Rubenstein's family office and a couple of others. So I think those are useful, but we want to think more about, about ways to improve that sharing of know-how, if you will, in the family office network generally. I think it's quite useful.
That's one of the things that a lot of the families say, that it's really important to network with other families that don't have agendas. They've got the same issues and concerns that you have, and just to kind of share best practices. And it's not necessarily, there's not like a school that everybody goes to.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, I think there's more academic study of it now, certainly, than when I began my professional career back in the Coolidge administration, it seems, and it was just kind of not a thing. So I think there's more understanding of it now. But I mean, you've been kind to say that we have figured some things out here, but it really was sort of feeling the elephant and saying, okay, well, this makes sense, but is it going to work? I don't know. It has been, it's been pleasing, but to a certain extent, kind of surprising to say, wow, that worked well, and it would have been helpful as we were creating Cynosure to have had more, just more folks with different experiences to sound things off of, to bounce things off of, and use as sounding boards. And we didn't at the time, and so we're eager to try to expand that.
You mentioned something earlier, which is fascinating, and I talk about this a lot, that had this been a private equity deal, we wouldn't be talking right now, right? So the company would have been sold in 3 to 5 years. So here's a question, and again, there is no right answer, but I want to get your thoughts on it, because I believe that in the mid 80s, private equity and venture capital disrupted the public markets. It was a better model. 2% covers the overhead, 20% I only make money if you make money. That made sense. Many, not all, many of the private equity firms have become massive. And it's almost become an AUM game, which is an almost inherent conflict of interest in some instances. So how do you, let's say you own a widget company and you're looking to sell, to a private equity firm or a family office. Private equity firm probably going to pay a little bit more than the family office. Why should the widget company go to you, or why should the widget company go to a family office? Talk about patient capital and what value adds the family offices have.
So I think, I certainly want to be fair to my colleagues in the private equity industry. I do think that there are situations where the widget company will do well to sell to traditional private equity. If the widget company has grown as large as you the founder or manager think that it's going to grow, and your main interest is, I need to get the best price for this asset at this moment, because I think this is the moment at which it will get the best price ever, for the actual value of the business. It has, its period of fast growth is behind it, and its period of steady growth is ahead. A private equity firm knows how to make money in a period of steady growth, principally through adding a lot of leverage, is how it has done it in the past, but they add operating efficiencies and so forth as well. It's useful. And if you, the founder, have taken it as far as you want to go and you're ready to sell it, you should sell it, right? That's what we emphasize, is that if you're the founder of a widget company and you don't want to sell your company, you believe that it has a lot of growth ahead of it, and you not only don't want to sell it now, you don't want to take capital that's going to sell it and churn the company 3 years from now, possibly to another private equity firm that would sell it and churn the company 3 years after that. But nonetheless, you need some capital that's going to, and it's your baby. You're happy with how you're managing it. You're managing it well. You don't want to be at risk of somebody kicking you out because they bought your company and now you work for them. Then our sort of investing philosophy is very much for you. You could call what it is that we do, and what a lot of family office, private investing operations do, we could call it growth capital. Growth capital tends to focus on technology, certain amount of healthcare. There's plenty of that type of growth capital for those things. But if you're an industrial widget maker, there's plenty of private equity that will buy your company. But there's very little capital that will come in apart from these sorts of family office operations that will say, look, we will invest and grow with you over a long period of time. We're going to take the long view. We don't have to sell on a 7-year time, on a 3-year time horizon, even a 5 or a 7-year time horizon. We'll hold this as long as it continues to compound at a high rate. And then when we're all ready to say, okay, now it's time. The period of high growth is behind us. It's time to sell this company. When you, the founder, are ready to, we'll all sell it together, probably to a private equity firm, or maybe we take it public. And that kind of capital, it's surprisingly rare in the United States. We've been very successful in the investing results we've had with it, being able to fill that role in the system. And given that, it's somewhat surprising to me that there aren't more people that do it, but it's a relatively limited group. And usually either family offices or firms like ours that are quasi-family offices, they're commercial firms, but anchored with a family office investing mindset.
So you talked also, we're dealing with patient capital. Outside, if I don't want to sell if I don't think the widget company is at maximum price, right? So I agree with you. I get the fact that if I think I've maximized the profitability, I'm going to sell to a private equity firm. If that's not the case, and you still think there's growth, are there advantages to going to private equity? Or, in your opinion, if a family office has the infrastructure like yours or the Pritzkers or David Rubenstein's firm, isn't it better in most instances if the family office has the infrastructure to go with the family office if you're looking at it from a long-term perspective?
I think yes. I mean, I think almost without exception, by definition, if you have a longer term horizon than just a few years, because it's the pressures on traditional private equity are pretty significant. So our private equity investing arm, it raises funds like a private equity fund, but our investing strategy is different than typical private equity. And so when we go out to institutional investors, as opposed to other family offices for funds, again, our investing returns are terrific, but but the questions they have are, well, when are you going to exit these investments? And our answer is, that's not as when they stop growing at the rate that they're growing, it's not in a year, it's not a year or two. Well, how much money have you returned to us, in the last, to your investors in the last 2 years? It's like, well, all they want, because they want these investments to continue to grow. And that sort of pressure on a typical private equity firm that isn't anchored by a family with a long-term view that says, look, there will always be enough money for what you want to do, to the investing team. The pressure there is pretty great. And so they won't be able to resist selling your company as soon as it can be made ready for sale and a good profit can be made on it. If you've got a long-term view, you want your capital to come from a place like ours.
When I was speaking to David Rubenstein, we were talking about, I see a private equity firm buys a company from a family, and then they hold it for 3 to 4 years, and they sell it to private equity firm B, and they hold it for 4 to 5 years, and they sell it to private equity firm C. And over a 20-year period, you could see the same firm change hands 4 times, maybe 5 times. And if you look at the taxes and the disruption in everything versus a family like yours or the Pritzkers or David, who could buy it and hold it, the returns are like not even close because you guys have the ability to compound it.
Particularly when you take tax into effect. So the large private equity firms, they fill an important role in this ecosystem. I was a partner at Carlyle for many years. I love the place, and I don't want to denigrate what firms like that do, which is to provide throughput to the large pension funds.
Mm-hmm.
So the message of the very large private equity firms is you can get better returns, by investing in smaller companies, with smaller private equity firms, that have different strategies. But if you want to put out $1 billion a year, if you have a huge amount of assets that you must allocate to private equity, we can push that through the system for you. And that's not something that we can do at Sinosure, nor are we intending to do, because it would harm our returns. What we're seeking to do is to get the highest returns possible for the family capital, and that aligns us with the other capital that comes in, whether that's from family offices or institutions, but that these will be the highest returns possible following this strategy, and particularly tax adjusted. If you're a taxable investor, and the pension funds don't care that the investment moves from Carlyle to Blackstone to TPG to KKR, because they own them all and they don't pay taxes as it moves from pocket to pocket to pocket. So they are, in fact, benefiting from the growth over that whole period of time. But even a very large family office doesn't own all of Blackstone and Carlyle and KKR and TPG. So it ends up at some point in that cycle of having to redeploy. And every time it moves, the taxable parts of the family ecosystem have to pay taxes, and it's extremely inefficient.
Right. Well, listen, I could talk to you for hours. You've done obviously a phenomenal job with running your family office in Sinosure. Two final questions. In your opinion, what inning are we in the evolution of family offices?
Second or third?
I
No,
agree.
yeah.
What's interesting to me is that you've got $10 trillion in capital, which is there's 6.5 trillion globally in hedge funds, so it's bigger than the entire hedge fund universe. But you've got 84.4 trillion coming downstream from the baby boomers of the next gen in the next 20 years. So this market's going to be bigger than the entire private equity market.
Yeah.
So everything you're saying is correct. I agree with. The industry, as we have to come together, is there are not a lot of firms like yours or the Pritzkers or the Rubensteins who can do this. So in theory, it's great, but there's still a lot of work to go. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I think, and I think there's an increasing understanding in the family office world that, that there are roles for different folks in the ecosystem, right? So, there are roles for those who are going to say, we will take on the burden of really gathering first and assessing first-class investment talent and of creating the structures in order to deploy and retain them. And then there are others who would say, and that's an ecosystem that we want to be part of. We either don't have the history or don't have the interest in trying to create one for ourselves. But we do know that sort of just going to the, to the very large name brands is not actually going to get us the best returns for what it is that we want to do, because all of those have been created to solve a different problem than our family office problem. Like I said, the large private equity firms, they have a great role and they do a great job at providing throughput to pension plans. But you're not a pension plan. This ought to be the world in the ecosystem in which you operate. And if you're not going to create your own sort of node, you should attach yourself to one or more nodes of folks who are doing that. And I think that, again, a decade ago, there were a whole lot of folks who said, how hard can this be? Right. I made a lot of money in my industry, or my family has made a lot of money in its industry. And we seem to be paying a lot of fees to folks. And just how hard can this be? And over the course of the last decade, a lot of them have had their heads handed to them and said, oh, well, actually, it's harder than we thought. But the instinct is still right, which is, but we don't belong over here in this ecosystem, which is designed for a different type of institutional capital that has, different characteristics and different objectives than we do as a family, and we ought to participate in the family office ecosystem.
Last question. This is something that I ask all of my guests. You've done extraordinarily well, from kindergarten through today. I mean, academically and career-wise, et cetera. You've also done a lot philanthropically. You've got a wonderful reputation in the community. What are you most grateful for?
I'm grateful for many, many things. Sometimes I like to say that I'm the luckiest person in North America. But I am most grateful. I mean, it sounds sort of schmaltzy and easy to say, but it's nonetheless true. I am most grateful for the family that I'm part of, and the support and togetherness and community spirit that that is inculcated and supported and deeply felt there. And I'm grateful for that every day.
Well, this has been terrific. It's great seeing you, and I look forward to seeing you in a few months.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Good to
you.
talk.
Thanks for tuning into Family Office World for today's show. Please make sure to subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. I'll see you on the next episode.
Family offices have approximately $10 trillion in assets, with another $65 trillion being transferred from baby boomers to the next generation in the next 15 years.
This is the largest transfer of wealth in history.
Family offices will soon control more money than the entire private equity and venture capital industries combined.
The family office world is going to disrupt the way in which funds are raised. The world is changing so rapidly, so quickly. If you look at my generation versus my children's, there's been a bigger change, in my opinion, than any generation, including the Industrial Revolution. We are only in the second inning in the evolution of family offices.
Every high-end service provider is trying to break into the lucrative family office market, mostly with limited success. Let Ron Diamond, one of the industry's most sought-after advisors, show you how he and his team have been able to navigate the family office landscape while developing meaningful relationships.
I was giving a keynote at Stanford about 2 years ago, and I had $5 billion families on the stage. And I asked each one of them, I said, what's a family office and why did you create it? And I had 5 completely different answers. And nobody was wrong or nobody was right. But that's kind of where this industry is. Only 25% of family offices make it to the second generation. 10 make it to the third, and 5 make it to the fourth. So the model doesn't work. Here's what we need to do. We need to come together as a community and share best practices.
Representing over 100 family offices, from 250 million to 30 billion, Diamond Wealth has curated a community of family offices to collaborate and share best practices. We are now ready to share that thought leadership with service providers everywhere. We are at a tipping point, and there is no better guide into the world of family offices than Diamond Wealth.